Okay, let's get started. So this week we're looking to the future. So we're looking at how the digital economy might evolve over the coming decade or two, but more broadly also how the internet is likely to evolve. So the internet today is basically inseparable from the digital economy. So the ways in which the digital economy develops are also going to impact how the internet itself develops. Now, first, a quick note. Module evaluation is available on Keats now. I do encourage you to fill it out. It's useful not only for the faculty, it's also really useful for me. So I don't get a whole lot of feedback about what works, what doesn't work. This is your one chance to really let me know what you enjoyed, what you didn't enjoy, and basically how can I improve the module for future students. So it is quite useful, and I do read through this stuff. Okay, so the topic of the day, the future of the internet. To understand the future, we need to understand the past. The idea of the internet was to have something which would be global, interconnected, and equal, so across the entire world. The idea of the internet was originally to be a seamless system, which meaning there would be no gaps in access. It would be a borderless system, so the internet wouldn't pay attention to national boundaries, it wouldn't pay attention to geopolitical conflict or anything like that. And it was also meant to be an equal system, so no bias in the transmission. Any information that is sent or received, it wouldn't matter who you were or where you were, all information would be treated equally on the internet. That's the ideal internet. And it was built into it from its very origins. So when it was first built, the idea was that the internet should fundamentally enable any information to be sent from one device to any other willing device. We oftentimes think about the origins of the internet as being the Department of Defense in America trying to build this communication system which would survive a nuclear war. So basically building a system which wasn't centralized but was instead decentralized and therefore much more difficult to attack. Now that's partly true, but the Internet Protocol was initially developed to fundamentally ensure that soldiers could communicate with each other across different networks. So this sort of idea of communication, the free flow of information, the free flow of data, that was at the heart of what the Internet was all about. Now, in many ways, Web 2.0 which is a sort of mid-2000s idea of what the internet was all about. Web 2.0 was sort of the culmination, or at least the very closest that we've come to those ideals of the internet. I love this quote from Tim O'Reilly back in 2005. Tim O'Reilly is somebody who's been around the digital economy, the internet more broadly. He's been around it for decades now. He knows it inside and out. And in 2005, he wrote, "Any Web 2.0 vendor that seeks to lock in its application gains by controlling the platform will, by definition, no longer be playing to the strengths of the platform." Now, I think that's fascinating because the past 15 years have basically been a refutation of that argument. What we've seen and what we saw in this class is that we've seen centralized platforms dominating, taking more and more control, controlling more of the internet. So this idea of the Web 2.0 as being an open space hasn't survived since 2005. Now here's a good example of the change, I think. So this is a quote from a journalist talking about how Twitter used to be when it was in the age of Web 2.0 and the open web. So for example, Twitter ran as a service for which many companies created clients and extensions within the company's ecosystem. Twitter delivered tweets you could read not just on twitter.com, but on TweetDeck or Twitterrific or Echophone or Tweetbot, sites made by independent companies which could build new things into their interfaces. There were URL shortening startups like TinyURL and Bitly and TwitPic for pictures. And then there were those companies drinking at the fire hose of Twitter's data, which could provide the raw material for a new website or service. Twitter and the experience of it was a cloud of startups. So the idea here being that Twitter, when it first came about, basically allowed anybody to have access. It opened up its application programming interfaces, it opened up its data, and it allowed a bunch of different companies and individuals to build stuff on top of it. Now today, most of these things are gone. Twitter has been closing itself down, as have most of the platforms. It's much more difficult to get access to these things, and oftentimes companies will start charging for access to the data. So that fire hose of data, which any company could use beforehand, is now something which Twitter has monetized. So all these things, these are ways in which what was once an open web and open services have now become increasingly enclosed. So the ideals of Web 2.0 seem to have ended. And this is, a number of journalistic stories over the past 5 years or so, basically people pointing out that those ideals are dying quite rapidly. So more and more people are concerned about the fragmentation of the internet, the move away from the open web, and the turn towards closed platforms. So the question I want to look at today is, will the internet remain open and global? Will it sort of maintain those early ideals, or is it more likely to become closed and fragmented? Now, when we talk about fragmentation of the internet, there's three types to worry about. The first of these is technical fragmentation of the infrastructure of the internet. We're not going to get into that much today. I'll sort of briefly gesture towards it, but largely that requires some technical information which I don't want to presume anybody knows. So we'll sort of glide past that, but I will point towards it. The other type of fragmentation is government fragmentation. So these are policies that prevent the creation, access, or distribution of information online. So governments passing laws which prevent this stuff. And then the third type of fragmentation we'll look at is capitalist fragmentation. So in this case, it's not governments deciding to block or impede the flow of information. Instead, it's companies, for one reason or another, deciding to block or impede the flow of information. So we'll look at these, each of these in turn. The first one is technical fragmentation. And like I said, I'm not going to go through this in any depth. If you are interested in this topic, let me know. I can pass you some more resources on it. But it requires some technical information, which we could spend a whole module learning about this stuff. So technical fragmentation is happening quite a bit, but again, it's not going to be the focus today. Instead, we'll start with government fragmentation of the internet. So the relationship between states and the open internet. Now, between 1970 and 2001, there was relatively few tensions between states and the internet. And in particular, relatively few tensions between the American state and the internet, which they were sort of the fundamental driver of. The US basically saw the internet and the globalization of the internet as being another sort of tool of American power. So it was Silicon Valley companies, American companies, driving that globalization of the internet, who had the power and the resources and were benefiting from it. So the globalization of the internet in many ways went in hand with the globalization of the economy. Both were driven by a lot of American interests. And the idea was that the open internet would basically allow every country to grow more rapidly. So let's say, for instance, a company in America develops a new production technique. It allows them to produce more goods, make more money. It benefits everybody. Why have that information stuck in America? Why not spread that around globally? So the global flow of information was supposed to improve the global economy as well. Now, of course, in 2001, major event happens, 9/11. 9/11 is a major turning point for the relationship between the state and the internet. So America saw the internet as being this beneficial thing. They saw it as being something which basically was in the national interest. 9/11 changes that because suddenly they recognize that the internet is not just a beneficial tool, it can also be used for incredibly malicious purposes as well. So America starts reasserting itself, reasserting its national power over these global flows of information. And it starts building, in particular, a massive surveillance system to monitor what's happening on the internet in order to try and prevent something like 9/11 from happening again. Now, since then, we've seen China also doing similar things, blocking off access to global parts of the internet and monitoring it. And Russia as well has also been doing this, blocking off access to global parts of the internet and monitoring domestic information. One thing I think is important to note here, oftentimes today, if you read American press, it's presented as solely a China and Russia thing which is happening. In fact, it was the Americans who were leading in this monitoring and surveillance of the internet. So it's every major global power is doing this sort of thing. Okay. Now, in 2013, we get the Edward Snowden leaks. So he releases information about how pervasive U.S. surveillance is. So most security agencies around the world and most people who study this stuff knew that the U.S. was spying a lot on the internet. We didn't really know the full extent of it, though. And the Snowden files basically proved how extensive it was. Now, what happens here is that basically every other country in the world looks at that information and they say, well, we don't want our information to be surveilled by the American state. So quite justifiably, a number of countries start trying to turn away from a global internet which is underpinned by American infrastructure and American companies. So what we've seen since then is a new regionalization tendency within the internet. So moving away from that global internet towards more regional or national internets. Now this has been known as either data nationalism or data localization. It's defined here as laws that limit the storage, movement, and or processing of data to specific geographies and jurisdictions, or that limit the companies that can manage data based upon the company's nation of incorporation or principal sites of operations and management. What does that all mean in practice? Well, there's a number of things it means. First of all, it means that countries are introducing laws which mean that if a company has personal data about its citizens, that data, for instance, can't leave the country. Russia is a great example of this. Russia passed a law which says that if you as a company have data on Russian citizens, that data can't leave Russia. What happened is LinkedIn refused to agree to that, and LinkedIn subsequently was blocked from Russia. And there's a number of countries who are doing similar things. China's looking at similar options. India's looking at similar options. But it's also a rich country thing as well. So Australia has rules about personal health data. Can't be moved out of the country. In Canada, some provinces, for instance, mandate that government data can't be stored in America. Has to be stored locally. So almost every country in the world is doing some sort of data localization. They're saying that if you have important data about our country or about our citizens, it can't be moved out of the country. This is a nice reminder that data is also, it's a material thing. It's not something which just exists everywhere. It is physically stored in particular places. And where those places are is a real matter of geopolitical debate right now. Now, data localization also means things like making sure that internet routing occurs either within a country or that it passes other countries, that it misses other countries. So here's an example of a proposed transatlantic cable between Brazil and Europe, between Brazil and the EU. And the idea here is that this will allow internet data to bypass America. Rather than internet data being routed from South America to America and then to Europe, this goes directly from South America to Europe. And precisely the reason is that if it bypasses the American jurisdiction, America finds it much more difficult to spy on it. So that's another example of data localization. And again, it's another example of fragmentation. It shouldn't matter where that data goes, but because of geopolitics, it does. It also means data localization using local tech companies rather than foreign tech companies. China is the best example of this, explicitly blocking a lot of foreign tech companies and mandating local tech companies instead. But there's a really good example in France. So France just recently mandated that any public institution, so governments or schools or anything like that, they can't use Google as a search engine. They have to use Qwant, which is the French local homegrown version. So they're mandating that you use a local tech company to try and help them grow rather than the American one. Another really interesting example is Ethiopia. So Ethiopia has blocked Uber and other foreign ride-sharing companies from operating in their country, and instead what's happened is they've got local alternatives that have risen up in their place. What this all means, though, is, of course, a fragmentation of the internet. In an ideal situation, we could all use something like Google, and it wouldn't be dominated by any one country. It wouldn't be controlled by any one country. Instead, it would just be a universal service which did what it was supposed to do, gave us the right answers when we search on the internet. That's not what's happening, though. We're seeing localization and fragmentation. Now, another example of fragmentation has to do with the domain name system. Now, the domain name system is effectively the phone book of the internet. It's a sort of simple way to think about it. So we as humans, we use domain names. We type in facebook.com or newyorktimes.com. Browsers, on the other hand, use IP addresses. And so every domain name is associated with an IP address. And the DNS basically translates between them. So when you type in facebook.com, DNS translates that into an IP address, which then directs you into the right directions. Now, at the moment, this is a universal system run by a global institution. So it's basically a global phone book. However, there are proposals and efforts to try and turn this into a national system instead. So replace the universal one with a national DNS, every country running their own DNS. And this would be akin to sort of how the telephone system works right now. So if you're in the UK, you've got a UK phone number, and you want to call France, you have to add a country code beforehand. to be able to do that. So a similar thing would happen with the internet. You would have to add extra letters, numbers, whatever the case may be, in order to access the local version of it. Now, it seems like a relatively minor technical change, but it does have some significant consequences. So first of all, companies would have to go to each country and secure a national version of their sites. There wouldn't be a universal site. There wouldn't be .coms, .orgs, anything like that. It would be instead .co.uk sort of thing. Every single company would have to get their own national version in every country of the world. Now, it would also become much easier to route users to malicious and fraudulent addresses. So let me give an example. You've got, let's say, a bunch of Americans who are used to typing in facebook.com to get to Facebook. Now, in another country, facebook.com might reroute to a malicious site. So when that American travels abroad and they type in facebook.com into their browser, it could be rerouted to something which looks exactly like Facebook but isn't Facebook. So it becomes much easier to do that sort of thing when you've got a fragmented DNS. The other thing is a fragmented DNS also makes it much easier for countries to simply block access to entire other countries. So you can imagine quite easily Russia blocking access to American sites, or America blocking access to Iranian sites. There's all sorts of quite easy scenarios that we could think up. And again, this is a fragmentation of the internet. We're supposed to have open, interconnected, seamless, equal access. That's not what's happening here. So the fragmentation of the DNS could have profound implications for the rest of the internet. Another technical system which is facing fragmentation is the satellite navigation infrastructure. So when you open up your phone, you open up Google Maps, it's reliant upon GPS. And GPS is an American system, fundamentally an American military system. And they've allowed the rest of the world to use it relatively freely. But of course, this is a problem, particularly if you're a country like Russia, or Iran, or Venezuela, countries which don't have the best relationship with America. That sort of dependency on an American infrastructure is pretty worrying. Why could they not just cut off access at any point in time? So what we're seeing is that that dependency on the American system is leading a lot of countries and regions to try and build up their own satellite navigation systems. So Europe, China, India, and Russia are all building up their own satellite navigation systems, their own competitors to GPS. And on a side note, Britain has sort of been screwed over by Brexit because they paid billions into the Galileo project. And as we now leave Europe, we're no longer going to have access to Galileo, which means we've now wasted billions of pounds. Wonderful. So this is what's happening, is we're starting to see a fragmentation of the satellite navigation system as well. And currently these things are interoperable. They can talk to each other, but that's not always necessarily the case. So for instance, the Russian system and GPS, the American GPS, they've blocked access between those two recently. Okay. We also have digital protectionism. So again, thinking about how states are leading to a fragmentation of the internet, another way is because they're worried about their national economy. So one thing that's happening is blocking particularly American tech giants from a regional internet, and therefore enabling local alternatives to rise up. China is again the most obvious and successful example of this. If China hadn't blocked a lot of American companies, you wouldn't have Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent. We may not have TikTok. All these sorts of things which are increasingly becoming global companies is because of the way in which China approached the internet. Now, it's not just China doing this. Germany and France have also very explicitly sort of looked in envy at the Chinese situation. And again, they want their own sort of tech giants that aren't just American ones. So Europe is very much looking at what China has done and may follow it to some degree. So again, that's sort of driven by concerns about the national economy. Now that leads us nicely onto the sort of economic drivers of fragmentation. So how does capitalism, as the economic system that we live in, how does that relate to the internet? And on one hand, we might think that capitalism is all about the free flow of information. But this isn't always the case. So we saw earlier that open platforms were sort of the Web 2.0 ideal. This is the idea of services freely connecting with other services. If you want to build some sort of new business or service on the basis of Twitter's API or Twitter's data, you were free to do that at one point in time. Messaging was interoperable at one point in time as well. I can remember in the early 2000s, there was 10 different messaging platforms, but it didn't matter because you could download one piece of software which would allow you to connect to all of them. So it didn't matter what your friends were on because you could connect to MSN Messenger and ICQ and all these other things. It was one service which made them interoperable. And then we didn't really have apps. It was an open web, and the web was determined by hyperlinks, which didn't really allow for the sort of hierarchy and centralization that we see with apps and platforms. Now, that has been changing, and I think a large reason why that's been changing is because of the economic imperatives of our mode of production. So we like to think about the largest platforms, Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, all these things. We like to think about them as being almost monopolies that are free from competition. But this isn't quite the case. They actually do compete with each other. So the most obvious example is Google and Facebook fighting over advertising dollars. So if somebody spends an advertising dollar with Facebook, that means they're not spending it with Google. So they're in direct competition for that money. Amazon is also getting into the advertising game. It's something which has been growing extremely rapidly in Amazon. They're now making use of all the data they've collected to try and produce ads. So three-way fight there. You've also got Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, all competing for smart home hubs, very directly. And this is basically for control over the smart home. So the smart home is going to be a huge source of data for these companies, a huge source of resources, and they're all fighting right now to control it. I would say Google and Amazon are at the forefront of it, but Apple and Facebook are also trying to as well. They're also fighting over digital assistants. So Apple has Siri, Google has Google Assistant, and Amazon has Alexa. All of these are competing to be the sort of voice interface for the future. And I think it's quite interesting because Siri came out first, and it was dominant and really impressive when it first came out. But Siri is now falling behind. And it's for a simple reason, because Apple is unwilling to collect a lot of personal data on people and use it to train Siri to get better and better. Whereas Google and Amazon have no qualms about using your personal data to make their digital assistants better. Now that means Google and Amazon are leading and Siri is falling behind, but this is again the sort of competition that's going on between these companies. Now all of this is going to increase as these companies become AI companies. Google has said it's an AI first company, Amazon is investing a huge amount of money in it, Facebook is investing large amounts, as are Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent. Every major tech platform is becoming an AI company today, which again puts them in direct competition. It puts them in direct competition for data, it puts them in direct competition for computing hardware, and in competition for the talent, the people who can actually, write the machine learning software. So there's a lot of competition here, and what do companies do? Well, one major response, I think, is walled gardens. Walled gardens are basically a way to maintain competitive advantage. They're a way to effectively block off access to competing services, and trap users inside of your platform, inside of your ecosystem. So walled gardens are effectively closed platforms or closed ecosystems where the owner controls the content, the applications, the appearance, and the rules. Now this gives the owners full control over the experience for the user. And it can be quite nice for the user, and that's sort of the point. If you, for instance, own an Apple product, Apple controls a lot of virtually all of the interface. If you're on Facebook, you can get a customized experience, which is customized to you. Data is not portable until recently, so you couldn't, for instance, move your data from Facebook to a competitor, which means that it becomes very difficult to move platforms. And then you also have this problem of proprietary peripherals. So, best example of this is Apple. If you buy into the Apple ecosystem and you start buying their hardware, you also end up buying a lot of their peripherals as well because they're designed to only work with Apple. So this is another way to lock in users. If you've spent a ton of money on specific chargers, specific headphones, all these sorts of things, you're not going to want to leave that system for Android or for Windows or anything else. So this is all ways of trapping users into a particular platform or ecosystem. So yeah, Apple's a really good example. Walled gardens are also often incompatible with other platforms. So they don't allow you to have easy access or any access to a competing service. For instance, you can't Google search through Facebook. Facebook doesn't use Google Translate, it uses Bing Translate. There's good reason for that because Google is a much bigger, more threatening competitor for Facebook. You can't use YouTube on Amazon Fire. You can't buy Apple's Smart Home Hub on Amazon. So there's all these ways in which companies are basically blocking access to their competitors to, again, prevent users from getting access to it. So that's the future of walled gardens. And I think it's not hard to imagine something like a Facebook future, where Facebook would create its own version of YouTube. It would have its own version of Amazon. You have Facebook Messenger already. Maybe they'll develop their own map section. Basically, Facebook trying to replace everything that you use on the internet and putting it into its own platform, into its own ecosystem. So at some point in time, users never have to leave Facebook. You would just be on Facebook perpetually. That's sort of the idea of a walled garden. Companies are already doing this, so if you're a small company, you probably don't have your own website, but you probably have a Facebook page. So that's already a way in which the open web is moving on to this closed platform of Facebook. Now, there's a really interesting and somewhat terrifying example of this happening right now, which is Facebook Free Basics. How many people have heard of Facebook Free Basics before? Okay, just a handful. So Free Basics is, Facebook presents it as being this sort of philanthropic thing which they're offering to the global south. What it is, it's a little app that you can download in specific countries, and it gives you free data light access to the internet. So if it's very difficult to get on the internet, and it's very costly to get on the internet in some countries, Facebook is offering effectively free access. But it has to go through Facebook's app. And Facebook chooses which sites are available. So again, it's not the entire internet that you get access to, it's what Facebook wants you to have access to. And again, it's provided for free, so Facebook says, well, this is us just being nice. But a number of countries have sort of recognized the problems of this approach. India, for instance, had a massive uproar when Facebook tried to introduce it there, and Facebook eventually had to pull the service back. And I'll give you an example as well. If you try to leave and go to the rest of the internet outside of that Facebook service, then this little thing comes up. It says, data charges apply. You are leaving free basics. Standard data charges will apply for it. So again, it's a way in which Facebook is basically closing off the rest of the internet and providing its own services instead. Now, there's been research on the impact of this in various countries. So this, I think, is terrifying. One survey asked people in a number of countries, do you agree with the following statement? Facebook is the internet. And in Nigeria, 65% of people agreed with that. In Indonesia, 61%. In the US, only 5% of people agreed that Facebook is the internet. That's, again, I think the ideal, not ideal, but it's the sort of the paradigm of the walled garden, is that your platform, your ecosystem, simply replaces the open internet. Okay. The next issue driven by a lot of economics is net neutrality. So net neutrality is the basic idea that services and information transmitted on the internet should all be treated the same. So it goes back to that original ideal that it shouldn't matter who you are, what information you're transmitting, or where you are. All information on the internet should be treated equally. Now, this is under attack, most obviously in America, but elsewhere as well. Without net neutrality, this leads to a number of consequences. First of all, people would have to pay extra to avoid bandwidth slowdowns. So right now, we pay for internet access and we all get the same access. We can imagine quite easily, without net neutrality, the internet service provider is basically saying that if you want to keep your same speeds, you have to pay extra. And they'll start charging extras to get the same speeds that we have right now. Likewise, ISPs could easily block content or charge extra for it. So three of the biggest traffic users on the internet is YouTube, Netflix, and PlayStation downloads, actually. It's a huge amount of traffic just for PlayStation downloads. The ISP could basically say, if you're going to access those, we'll charge you extra. If you want access to Netflix, if you want access to YouTube, if you want access to a PlayStation download, you have to pay extra for it. So we start to see this hierarchy of access on the internet, simply because net neutrality has been erased. And effectively, the internet would become a toll system. If you want to go certain places, if you want to do certain things, you have to pay an extra fee for it. Now in America, they've recently repealed net neutrality in, I think it was 2017. Trump ordered the FCC to repeal the net neutrality laws. It's not entirely clear what the impact has been yet. In America, their internet tends to actually be quite terrible and highly monopolized. It doesn't seem to be getting any better with the repeal of net neutrality laws either. Okay, so that's another sort of fracturing of the internet. Now this leads us to a final section, the question of a fractured future. So we've talked a lot about fragmentation, but there's a lot of different types of fragmentation. So, for instance, we have always blocked packets, IP addresses, domains, and URLs at various times. And we've done so for quite legitimate reasons. So, for instance, you probably use a firewall at home or have one on your computer simply because you don't want the external world accessing your private network or your private computer. Technically, that's a fragmentation of the internet, but it seems like a very legitimate and justified fragmentation. We also block certain IP addresses because they send out spam, which again seems like a legitimate fragmentation. We always want to maintain some elements of privacy, and that's always going to involve blocking some connections. So we've always done fragmentation, and we've never had that sort of ideal state of the internet, purely open, seamless, interconnected. It's never existed. So the question is not really an open or fragmented internet, but what are the legitimate reasons for fragmentation, and what are the illegitimate reasons? So how do we want to build the internet in such a way that it enables sort of legitimate fragmentation and privacy and blocking and things like that, without turning it into Facebook's walled garden or something like that? Now, I think this is a really big question for the next 10 years. I think if we look at what's going on in the world right now, there's a lot of reason to believe that the internet's going to become more fragmented over the next 10, 20 years. So nation states are very much reasserting their power over the internet. I've seen in the past year numerous magazine headlines about basically the world being split into two internets, a Chinese one and an American one. There's a lot of worry about that right now. Companies driven by competition are increasingly building walled gardens as well. So cutting off services from other platforms, locking users into their own platforms and into their own ecosystems, and trying to build their own sort of self-sufficient little walled gardens. Facebook is doing this, Google is doing this, Amazon is doing this, and a lot of the Chinese platforms are as well. And then, of course, we have questions around the end of net neutrality, which has happened in America and may be picked up elsewhere as well. So if we go back to that starting point of a free and open, seamless, interconnected internet, we seem very much to be moving away from that. The internet as we know it today could be very different, will be very different in 10 years, and it may not be a better internet. I think that's quite concerning. On that depressing note, that's it for today. Are there any questions about that? Or are there any questions about the assessment? If there's any general stuff. We'll cover assessments in the seminars, but if you have any sort of general questions, I'm happy to take them now. All right. So if you're interested, there's a lot of really fascinating research that's been written on this stuff. And I do think it's one of the key questions and issues we'll be facing in the next 5-10 years. That's it. So I'll see everybody in the seminars.
对吧？ via Vienna. And if you know Vienna, you're going to have like half an answer done.
We studied in first year of law, and then
I had the first year as well. And then
first year.
Things like that.
yeah, but I do it in when
That's why he's speaking a lot about you.
There you go, man. There you go.
I just had to second. I don't know. I was kind of disappointed. It's like it has nothing to do with law. It's just like
So his argument was that
how could
the Mauritian
I don't know the question, like how
that would be
derivative
no,
trading.
that the
I don't know if he asked me, like he just
would have been
like I would do the best to do it to keep up with this development. So I thought that the question more about law was like who are helping and stuff. It's like this white thing and stuff. Yeah.
Because of the agreement
Mauritian
SPV, because it was through SPV.
no, it was one of the regions actually explained very well. The whole discussion was like there was not the Indonesian company called the because they wanted to take the use 10% rate that the Mauritius Indonesian Mauritius UK Mauritius Indonesian
Yeah, it's impossible to put everything in there.
after they signed the
Yeah, but I think it depends on the question what you actually need to put in the end. Because I don't think that you
and the contract with JP Morgan said that they have to take all reasonable measures to make sure they have a 10% rate in order to indicate the contract.
They have the right to no.
Yeah, but something changed. No, but they have to take all reasonable.
But if something changed, they could remove the
Yeah. If they took and then
This happened.
yeah, but JP Morgan wanted them to create another entity and then to be Indonesia, Mauritius, Netherlands, UK.
I think
And they said that was unreasonable because the Netherlands SPV wouldn't be an
or no, in the -1 where
And that
the
was
big canteen is, there's a work.
Before the there was a list. They said, okay,
Because in the food sector, I'm not going to do it. Because that's the national tax in order to avoid giving the nose. And the court ruled
Okay.
for in the food.
Okay, so now every day in one week is bigger.
was not able
Today, the court just
It was a contract. No, they have to.
tomorrow
The
there's this
UK court had to
by
look at this as a deal basically through an Indonesian
on
and
Friday
Netherlands
there's probably
perspective, or an imaginary case.
Yes, I think so.
It's a fun case.
Okay, I thought about that.
Obviously,
Yeah.
As was Maurice.
even like I would say like maybe the Mauritius company. No. But you could argue, the Mauritius. No, I would have made the argument. But you could argue the Mauritius company was the real.
Was it any different?
Because you have the contract. And the contract says you have to take all reasonable measures to ensure you have a reduced rate. And in response to that, you create a company to make sure you have a reduced rate. You're obviously like there's no way you can say you're making it.
Well, what they wanted to do is swap all those with the different formula, and it would be
It's very theoretical.
But one year before and one year after.
EU finance regulation. But you
No,
also
before you get to argue, you can lie.
so we always
It's not story. I like the 18 guy. Because it was before. But if it was after, you cannot say that.
But none of us
Because
will
the paper
say
says you do it.
what do you think, guys? staring on our screen.
Because
That's why I don't know what knowledge I
let's
should
pretend with it.
take from it.
But then
I failed to see the JP Morgan is in New York.
contract law. I mean, I assume, but usually those contracts, all disputes related to the contract will be governed by the law of the yeah. I usually, in South America, usually see there. Yeah, but like, remember one of the readings was like, which reading? I think it was La Soma? La Soma? PJ La Soma? So the guy said Prevost and Prevost and in the food. Prevost and even though the facts are very different, the decisions are like prima facie different. Lo que dices es lo mismo porque en Prevost hay un argumento de los socios que no es lo mismo. Y el acuerdo es justamente porque la compañía no es ellos.
And I think this kind of stuff is kind of similar to
por la misma razón,
but also
no
like
justo lo que en contra.
German law, so it's kind of, I'm out of training because we always have to with Excels and always like fact papers and to solve problems and not like essay. This one's closed.
Yo te parto con una semana de
All of the others are open. Yeah, no, some law, but not our computers, except in
Sí, la voy a aclarar.
Yeah, but you don't, our Excel is pretty short, like from the time and we don't have time doing, it's not like, oh, I need to write about this, okay, let's start reading the stuff, because they're like hundreds of pages long sometimes. So you know, it's like, yeah, I want to do that. Those books, Excel with essays, that's complicated.
Una vez que estoy trabajando este mes,
Yesterday was my last day of work, like, until the exam ends, exam period ends. The AC wasn't working, and it's like one of these building skyscrapers, and it's just made out of glass. So you can imagine it's not there. It was like 40 degrees. I was sitting there like,
mira, es una cuestión de porque lista y
I was so happy when it was
¿Tiene
over.
pantallas?
But it was pretty weird. I said to the IT, what I'm going to see, and when I returned, and her brother was like,
¿Qué decir? Porque tiene eso como mano. Ah, ok, soy Parezco
we had the offices right next to each other.
y dos pantallas de 24 pulgadas. Una
Like
es
every
Excel.
day, you're like, oh, how was the day? I was yesterday. I think it's okay to go in there and say,
Verdaderamente tengo que cuidar un
we
poco.
don't goodbye.
Y es que no,
Yeah,
O sea, tú ya estás disputando.
El día que este poder de presión supere el factor de forma de
I should have done the
Pero bien.
I think she's just social. And maybe that's
Ese es mi mouse.
Sí, no puedes comer.